I never thought a place could feel alive the moment you set foot inside it. But the depot did. The air smelled of rust, old coal, and something I couldn't name, something deeper, older. I had bought it impulsively, a decision I convinced myself was rational. A derelict train depot, miles from the nearest town, crumbling but full of history. It was perfect for someone like me, someone who chased isolation as much as opportunity. I thought I was prepared. I thought I understood what I was stepping into. I was wrong. The first time I walked along the tracks, I noticed how they stretched farther than any map suggested. They vanished into shadows, and yet at odd intervals. I swore I could hear the distant groan of rails under weight I couldn't see. My friends had warned me, of course. Abandoned places carry their ghosts, one said. Another laughed. It's just old metal and dust. But the warnings didn't prepare me for the sensation of being watched by something that didn't want me here. The building itself was quiet, too quiet. No trains moved, no workers called out, no engine whistles cut through the fog, but it was not silent. There was a pulse to the place, subtle at first, like the low hum of machinery long forgotten, or the rhythm of a heartbeat that wasn't my own. Doors creaked in empty corridors. A window rattled though the air outside was still. I told myself it was the wind. I told myself 100 times, but I could never shake the feeling that the depot was noticing me, judging me. I spent that first evening wandering, exploring rooms thick with dust and the smell of decay. Lockers lined the walls, their doors hanging ajar, and I imagined the lives of the men and women who once worked here. Some notes were left behind, old tickets and schedules, faded beyond readability. I tried to focus on mundane things, on tasks I could control, but the depot resisted. Shadows pooled in corners, refusing to align with the light. Stairs seemed longer than they should, hallways curved at impossible angles, and a staircase leading down into the basement felt like it had been watching me before I even noticed it. I bought the place because I loved the abandoned, the forgotten, the places left to rot, but this was different. This place had a personality, a memory. By nightfall, I realized my presence might not be welcome. Something whispered from the darkness, a voice too soft to understand, yet insistent. I dismissed it, though my stomach nodded. Rationality had its limits, and I was reaching mine. By the end of my first night, I was certain of one thing. The depot remembered its past. It remembered the people who worked here, the trains that ran endlessly, the schedules etched into metal and stone, and somehow it knew I didn't belong. I caught movement out of the corner of my eyeshadows that didn't match my own, figures that disappeared when I tried to look directly. I had heard of places with rules, old houses, temples, forests that the locals warned travelers to respect. I thought those were just stories, but in the stillness of that depot, I began to understand. I was about to learn that rules existed for a reason, and that breaking them had consequences far worse than a warning. The whisper returned as I turned to leave the main hall. It was barely audible, a rasp that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Be careful where you step, or the tracks will claim you. And just like that, I felt the first tremor of dread that would not leave me for the months to come. The morning after my first restless night, I decided to explore the depot more systematically. I wanted to catalog what remained, take photographs, maybe even make sense of the place before the unease consumed me. That's when I first met him, the caretaker. He appeared as if from nowhere, a thin, stooped figure in a dark coat, moving with a precision that felt rehearsed, deliberate. He didn't startle me, though my heart jumped. Somehow, he belonged here more than I did. New owner, he said, voice low, like gravel sliding over metal. I've been expecting you. There was no introduction, no handshake, only a list of eyes that seemed to measure, weigh, and file me away before I could even respond. I noticed a set of keys swinging from his belt, jangling softly, yet the sound was not quite in rhythm with his movement. almost as if the keys had a life of their own. He didn't guide me through pleasantries. Instead, he began with rules. I thought I was being introduced to a tour, but no. These were warnings, and they were serious. He spoke calmly, almost as if reciting poetry. Never step onto a track after dusk. He didn't explain why. I assumed it was safety, but his gaze told me it was more. Do not answer the calls of the whistle. The depot's old steam whistle had not sounded in decades, but he made it clear. If I heard it, I was not to respond. Do not linger in the basement after midnight. He paused here, as if measuring my reaction. Some doors do not forgive curiosity. Never disturb the ledger room. A small locked door at the end of the main hall, covered in dust. He never said what the ledgers contained, but I sensed dread in his silence. Do not follow shadows that move against the light. He said this almost as an afterthought, but his tone carried weight. Never touch the control room switches. The panels were old, rusted, and coated in grime. But the warning carried an urgency that made me step back instinctively. Always leave an object behind if the tracks call to you. He didn't clarify what sort of object, nor why, but I could feel the seriousness in the rule pressing against me. I nodded politely, masking the curiosity and skepticism that battled in my mind. The rules seemed bizarre, almost theatrical, but the way he delivered them, with that careful, measured weight, made it impossible to dismiss them outright. As he moved through the depot, he demonstrated some of the rules without speaking. When we passed the basement stairs, he never looked down, never paused. When we passed the control room, he simply adjusted his coat, eyes fixed on the ceiling. I realized quickly that these weren't just rules, they were rituals, enforced by the depot itself, and perhaps by whatever had taken residence in it long before me. I spent hours exploring the depot under his watchful eye. The morning sun slanted through broken windows, casting long, narrow lines across the floor. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, but every so often, a shadow would stretch unnaturally, moving faster than my mind could track. I chalked it up to fatigue, to imagination. Yet each time it happened, the caretaker's gaze followed, calm but unblinking. He never explained the history. He only let me see the edges. A rusted train engine in a far shed, its windows opaque with age. A clock in the main hall frozen at 3:17, its hands stubbornly unmoving. In each space, I felt eyes, invisible and patient, observing. The depot wasn't just a place, it was a presence, and the rules were the only thing standing between me and something I wasn't ready to understand. By late afternoon, he left me alone with a final remark, his voice softening, but still heavy with caution. The depot is patient, but it notices mistakes. Remember the rules, and remember this: the tracks always remember who walks on them. I watched him retreat down the long platform, keys jangling like distant bells. Once he disappeared, I felt a surge of freedom and something else, a chill that crawled along my spine. The depot felt quieter, almost holding its breath, as if waiting for me to act. I tried to shake it off and started examining the ledger room door. One of the very things he had forbidden. My fingers hovered over the knob, curiosity gnawing at me. Just for a second, I imagined opening it, imagining what secrets lay inside, and for a fleeting heartbeat, I felt a tug not from the door, but from the depot itself, a subtle, insistent pull that warned me, not yet. I stepped back. The rules, ridiculous as they seemed at first, now felt necessary. Every shadow, every creak of metal, every whisper of wind between broken windows carried weight. I didn't understand it yet, but I knew I was being tested, and perhaps even watched. By evening, the depot had transformed under the fading light. Corridors stretched longer, shadows pooled deeper, and the silence was no longer empty, it was full of intent. I realized the caretaker hadn't been giving me a tour. He had been preparing me for what the depot expected, and I knew as the first cold gust of night crept through the broken windows, that the rules were not suggestions. They were surviving. Night came faster than I expected, dragging shadows behind it that seemed almost alive. I had convinced myself that the rules were superstitions, exaggerations born from old stories and a caretaker's obsession. Curiosity clawed at me, and I found myself drawn to the basement stairs. The warning had been clear: do not linger in the basement after midnight. But my rational mind whispered, it's just a basement. The air grew colder as I descended. Each step creaked beneath my weight, echoing unnaturally against the walls. Dust hung thick, and the faint smell of damp iron made my stomach tighten. I paused halfway down, trying to convince myself to turn back, but the pull was magnetic. Something at the bottom of the stairs seemed waiting. I reached the landing and hesitated. The basement stretched before me, long and shadowed, shelves lining the walls with objects I couldn't yet identify. My flashlight flickered, then steadied, illuminating a small section of the floor. There, etched in the concrete, were faint markslines that looked like tracks. Not the depot's main tracks, but tiny grooves, etched carefully, almost deliberately, pointing toward a corner I had not explored. Something whispered. I froze. Not the wind, not a creak of the building. Something soft, coaxing. Almost human, but not quite. Come closer. I shook my head, telling myself it was imagination, a trick of exhaustion and darkness. Yet the whisper continued, faint, persistent. My curiosity won, as it always does, and I stepped toward the corner. As I neared, the air thickened, pressing against my chest. The shadows seemed to shift, stretching toward me, coiling around the edges of my vision. Then I saw it, a figure, a shadow that took human shapes lit along the wall, moving opposite to the light. I froze, heart hammering. I knew immediately what the caretaker's words meant. Do not follow shadows that move against the light, but my rational brain whispered, it's nothing, just a trick of the flashlight. I reached a trembling hand forward. The shadow responded. It moved again, subtly, almost taunting me, and the temperature dropped. My breath became visible, clouds in the narrow beam of the flashlight. Panic prickled at the edges of my mind, but fascination rooted me to the spot. Then the first consequence. A low metallic groan reverberated through the basement. Not the building settling, not a train. Something in the walls, moving. The marks on the floor, those strange, shallow tracks vibrated subtly beneath my feet, as if the depot itself resented my presence. My flashlight flickered violently, plunging me into darkness for a heartbeat. When it returned, the shadow was gone. I stumbled back toward the stairs, heart racing. Each step sounded too loud, like an accusation. I dared a glance over my shoulder. The corner where the shadow had been was empty, but I felt it. A weight, pressing, following, observing. My rational mind screamed, you almost broke the rules. Reaching the landing, I hesitated, chest heaving. The air felt thick, almost liquid, and I thought I heard the faintest echo of a whistle. Not outside, not at a distance, but inside, reverberating off walls I had just passed. I told myself I was imagining it, and yet I knew instinctively the rules were not arbitrary. The basement had noticed me. I bolted up the stairs, ignoring the creaks and groans, not daring to look back. When I reached the main hall, the first night's shadows were waiting, lingering in corners, deeper, darker. I pressed my hands against my face, trying to shake the sensation of being followed. The depot had claimed my curiosity, marking it somehow, and I didn't know what it would demand in return. By the time I calmed myself enough to speak aloud, my voice was barely a whisper. I won't break the rules again, I muttered, but it sounded hollow, even to my own ears. Because deep down, I knew curiosity was a debt I had already incurred. The first taste of the depot's enforcement had been subtle, just a whisper, a shadow, a pressure on my chest, but I felt it. I felt the warning in my bones. And as I settled in for the night, the memory of the whisper lingered. The tracks remember everything, and so do I. I thought the basement incident was a warning, a minor consequence of curiosity. I convinced myself to focus on practical matters, inventory, repairs, cleaning, but the depot had other plans. That night, as I worked near the main hall, I heard it, a long, low whistle. Not the wind, not the trains, which hadn't run in decades. It was sharp, deliberate, carrying through the empty corridors. I froze. The caretaker's warning echoed in my mind. Do not answer the calls of the whistle. My pulse quickened. I wanted to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't there, but something inside me stirred. A compulsion, subtle and insistent, urging me toward the source. I shook my head, whispered, "It's nothing. Ignore it." But the sound persisted. The depot seemed to lean closer, listening, testing. Step by step, I found myself moving toward the platform. Each footfall echoed too loudly, bouncing back with a strange resonance that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. The whistle cut again, closer, sharper, as if impatient. Shadows pooled in corners, shifting unnaturally, following me along the walls. I realized the truth, too late. I had almost broken the second rule. A faint, metallic smell filled the air, tangy and sharp. I glanced down the tracks. Something was moving there, or moving along them. Not a train, but a shadow stretched across the rails. Impossibly long, curling and writhing like smoke that had taken shape. My rational mind refused to accept it, and yet every instinct screamed that the depot had awakened something. I stopped, heart hammering. The shadow hesitated, then slid further along the rails, almost beckoning me. My legs refused to obey, but my eyes followed, hypnotized by its motion, and then I heard it soft, almost conversational. "Step closer. See what waits." I recoiled. The voice wasn't human, but it carried intent, intelligence. The rules had always felt like suggestions before, strange superstitions whispered by an old caretaker. But now, they were tangible, brutal in their logic. I had almost answered the whistle. I had almost stepped onto the track after dark, and whatever existed in the depot did not forgive near mistakes. The shadows shifted, coalescing near the far platform. I realized then that the depot itself was alive in a way I hadn't understood. It moved in layers: sound, shadow, air, and it was aware of me. A sudden gust of cold swept along the tracks, and the shadow jumped, stretching toward the platform edge. My stomach dropped. The whistle shrieked again, and the air vibrated. Pressing against my chest, I stumbled backward, tripping over a discarded piece of rail equipment. My flashlight flickered, casting frantic, darting shadows across the hall. The sound of something heavy scraping along the tracks behind me made me spin, but the shadow had disappeared, melting into the darkness as if it had never been there. The whistle faded, leaving a ringing silence that made my ears throb. Breathing hard, I realized that I had been reckless. The rules weren't arbitrary. They weren't folklore. Each warning was a boundary, each instruction a lifeline. Breaking them more, coming close, provoked attention. I could feel it still, the depot's awareness pressing against my shoulders, whispering through the floors and walls. The second violation hadn't been as overt as the first, but the tension it left behind was suffocating by the time I returned to the main hall. The depot had reverted to its quiet patience, as if nothing had happened, but I knew better. I had felt the weight of its judgment. Shadows lingered in corners longer than they should, and the faint, metallic temps of fear or something older remained in the air. I sank into a chair, shivering, listening to the hum of the building. Each creak, each draft, each whisper of air felt deliberate. The depot was teaching me, testing me. I didn't understand the rules fully, but the consequences of disobedience had become clear. Curiosity here was not harmless. It demanded repayment. That night, sleep was impossible. Every whisper, Every shadow, every distant echo of the long dormant whistle played on repeat in my mind. The depot was patient, but patience was not mercy. I had glimpsed only the beginning of what awaited me if I strayed again, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my bones, that whatever haunted these tracks was not content to remain hidden. It was aware, it was waiting. Answers. I started with the ledger room, the one place the caretaker had warned me to avoid. The door had always been locked, coated in years of dust. But during my rounds I discovered the old padlock had been pried open, hanging loose on one hinge. Part of me wanted to retreat, but another part, darker, whispered that understanding the depot's history was essential. Inside, the room was cramped and dimly lit, the windows obscured by grime. Rows of metal filing cabinets lined the walls, their drawers labeled with dates spanning decades. On the central desk lay a collection of journals, each one bound in worn leather, their pages yellowed and brittle. I picked one up with shaking hands and began to read. The first entries were mundane: schedules, employee notes, maintenance logs. But as I progressed, the tone shifted. An entry from 1947 caught my eye. The tracks move in ways the plans cannot explain. Shadows gather when a train is late. I hear whispers from the rails themselves. I fear the depot has begun to notice me. I swallowed hard. The words were meticulous, ordinary, but the fear beneath them was palpable. Flipping through further entries, I discovered reports of employees vanishing, always near the tracks, always after ignoring some warning. The handwriting became increasingly erratic, sentences fragmenting under a weight I could almost feel pressing through the paper. One journal included sketches maps of the depot with marks along the tracks, circles, lines, arrows pointing toward places that didn't exist anymore, staircases leading to nowhere, doors that opened into brick walls, tracks that seemed to twist back upon themselves. Beneath one sketch was a note, scrawled in desperation: "Do not follow the tracks at night. They lead to places no human should see." Curiosity gnawed at me, and I explored further. I found old surveillance footage stored on analog reels, dusty but functional in a projector I managed to coax into life. Grainy images flickered across the wall. The depot moved differently on tape. Shadows slithered along corridors with no source. Doors opened on their own, and figures always inhuman, elongated, distorted wandered along the tracks. Occasionally, a human employee appeared, stepping across the platform or descending stairs, only to vanish mid-step as if erased. The footage chilled me, but I couldn't look away. One reel showed an employee leaving a note. I broke the rules. I thought it was just superstition. The tracks, they remembered. Something followed me home. I hear it whisper my name. The camera then captured a shadow flickering past the doorway. Its form stretched, fingers long and spindly, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. I realized the depot's rules weren't meant for order, they were survival. They contained knowledge of a presence that existed both within and beyond the depot, a force that monitored attention, punished curiosity, and twisted perception. The whistle, the shadows, the basement, they weren't anomalies. They were part of a system, a logic designed to keep something contained, or perhaps to keep people alive, or alive enough to become part of the depot itself. As I sifted through more journals, I discovered a recurring name: Harlan Voss, an employee from the 1950s who had documented encounters with the entity. His notes described the tracks calling, the depot breathing, and doors that lead to other realms. He claimed that the depot was built on something older than the town, a junction between the mundane and the forbidden, and that every train, every rail, every echo was a thread connecting to something vast and incomprehensible. One entry made my blood run cold. I tried to leave. The depot allowed me only halfway. It pulled me back, whispered its rules, and I obeyed out of fear. But even obedience does not erase the debt. I see those who disobeyed, their forms twisted, wandering endlessly between rails and shadows. They are still here, just not in a way the living can recognize. I shut the journal, hands trembling. My flashlight flickered, shadows pooling in the corners of the ledger room. The depot seemed to exhale, almost satisfied that I understood a fraction of what it contained. The realization hit me. I wasn't alone. I had never been alone. The depot's presence had been tracking me from the first day, learning my patterns, testing my curiosity. I moved carefully, opening more drawers, discovering letters from families of missing employees, desperate pleas to authorities that were never answered. One letter, dated 1963, read, "They vanished near the east platform. Authorities found nothing. We fear the depot has taken them, but no one will believe us. If you read this, beware the tracks." My mind reeled. The horror wasn't just in the present. It spanned decades, consuming anyone who trespassed carelessly, anyone who ignored the rules. I could feel the gravity of the depot pressing against me, as if the shadows I had seen were only a hint of the force waiting, patient and eternal. I backed out of the ledger room, clutching journals and notes, my heart hammering in rhythm with the depot's invisible pulse. Each hallway seemed longer, each shadow more deliberate. The knowledge I now carried made the depot's warnings impossible to ignore. It wasn't simply about survival, it was about understanding the rules before the rules decided to act. By nightfall, I was no longer just a curious owner. I was a student of a place older than memory, a place with rules that defied human comprehension. The depot had revealed fragments of its truth, enough for me to grasp the stakes, but not enough to prepare for what came next. I realized then, with a sinking certainty, that discovery itself was dangerous. Understanding the depot's lore was only the first step. The second step was living long enough to obey the rules that now felt like lifelines. And the depot, patient as it always had been, waited for my next mistake. That night, I thought I could stay in the main hall, surrounded by the familiar shadows I had begun to understand. I was wrong. The whistle came first, sharp, sudden, and impossibly close. It cut through the darkness like a blade. My heart lurched, and my first instinct was to hide. But hiding did nothing. The depot had already found me. I felt it before I saw it, a presence that pressed against my mind, heavy, insistent, and impossibly patient. I grabbed my flashlight, but the beam was swallowed immediately. Shadows bled into one another, thickening into shapes I could not name. The temperature plummeted, and my breath came in ragged clouds. I moved toward the stairs leading to the basement, reasoning that maybe being on higher ground would help, but the depot had other plans. A sound, metallic and grinding, echoed from the far platform. My eyes strained through the darkness. At first I saw only the tracks, gleaming faintly under the weak light of a broken lamp. Then the shadow appeared, a form too long, too fluid, moving with a speed that made no sense. It crawled along the rails, stretching impossibly across the platform, fingers grazing the ground as if tasting the air. I froze. The caretaker's rules came rushing back. Never step onto a track after dusk. Never answer the whistle. Never follow shadows that move against the light. And yet, instinct and terror rooted me in place, watching as the shadow stopped abruptly, as if it had noticed me. It moved toward me, not slowly, too fast for normal comprehension, yet deliberate. I stumbled backward, crashing into a fallen chair, the sound deafening in the silence. The shadow halted a moment, almost observing me, before lunging again. I turned and ran, my flashlight bouncing wildly across the hall, casting my own shadow in grotesque exaggeration along the walls. The depot responded. Doors slammed shut behind me, echoing with finality. Corridors shifted subtly, as if the building itself were rearranging, herding me toward its will. I ducked into a side room, pressing myself against the wall, listening. The shadow, or whatever it was everywhere at once. I could hear it sliding along the floor, brushing against metal, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. It carried intent, malevolent, and precise. I tried to recall the journals, the warnings, the rules. Every fiber of my being screamed, survive, obey, move carefully. But logic had limits here. I was trapped in a space that obeyed its own rules, where light, shadow, and sound were weapons. The whisper came again, closer, coiling around my ears. You lingered too long. The tracks remember. My vision swam. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into suffocating darkness. I could hear the rails humming, vibrating with a low, insistent resonance. I realized then that the depot's threat was not just visual, it was physical, tangible, pressing against my chest, testing my ability to breathe. I remembered one of the more obscure rules: leave an object behind if the tracks call. I didn't fully understand it, but desperation demanded action. My hands grasped the nearest thing, a heavy wrench from the maintenance room, and I threw it toward the shadow. It passed through the object as if it were smoke, but for a moment, the presence recoiled. That brief hesitation gave me a chance to run. I bolted across the hall, not toward the basement, not toward the control room, but toward a side exit I had discovered earlier. The shadow followed, faster than my legs could carry me, moving with impossible angles and fluidity. Each time I glanced back, it seemed closer, stretching impossibly across the distance. The depot itself seemed to participate. Stairs lengthened unnaturally as I climbed them, corridors bent around me, and doors I had passed hours before now blocked my path. I realized the building and the entity were intertwined, a single, conscious predator. Escape wasn't just a matter of moving quickly. It was about predicting, obeying, surviving. I made it to the roof of the main hall, panting, trembling, heart hammering. The city beyond the depot was a distant haze, irrelevant. The shadow emerged behind me, rising from the platform below. I could see now that it had no fixed form. Fluid, stretching, folding into itself, endlessly ad abdoble. Its whisper crawled into my mind, repeating, "The tracks remember. The tracks remember." I understood then that there was no negotiation, no reasoning. This wasn't a creature in the traditional sense. It was the depot's will, a force older than memory, enforcing the rules with patient, relentless cruelty. And I had already broken to dot in a moment of instinctive desperation. I leaped from the roof onto a lower platform, the metal groaning under my weight. The shadow hesitated, then followed, sliding impossibly down the side of the building. I ran, zigzagging across the platform, searching for anything, anywhere, that could offer temporary refuge. Finally, I ducked into the control room. The panels, coated in decades of grime, seemed to hum with energy. I pressed myself against the wall, gasping for breath, listening. Outside, the shadow lingered, coiling along the tracks, waiting. The depot had allowed me inside for now, but I could feel the tension, the judgment, the inevitability. Hours passed, or maybe minutes' time, had no meaning here. Every sound, every shadow, every whisper reminded me that the depot was patient and relentless. I had survived, barely, but the entity had marked me. The first violations had been tests. This encounter was a warning. By dawn, the shadow retreated, fading into the deeper corridors. But its presence lingered, a cold weight pressing against my spine. I understood now, the depot was not just haunted, it was alive, intelligent, and it remembered, it waited, and it had already begun counting my mistakes as I collapsed against the control room wall. Chest heaving, I realized the full scope of the danger. The depot's will was absolute. The shadows, the tracks, the whispers, they were all instruments of something vast, patient, and eternal. And I had only just begun to understand that survival here was not about courage, or strength, or speed. It was about obedience, attentiveness, and accepting that some rules existed for reasons no human could ever fully grasp, because if I failed again, The depot would ensure that I would not live to question why. By the next evening, I had convinced myself that the caretaker, the man who had given me the rules, was my only ally in this impossible place. I needed guidance, a touchstone for sanity. But the depot had other plans. I found him in the ledger room, bent over a set of journals I had not seen before. When he looked up, his eyes were unreadable, shadowed by the dim light, and for the first time, I felt the full weight of his presence, not just as a human, but as someone deeply entwined with the depot's strange will. "You've learned quickly," he said, voice calm, almost approving. "But speed is not enough. You must understand obedience." I nodded, relief mingling with fear. "I've seen what happens when the rules are broken. I've seen the shadow." My voice faltered, memories of the previous night flooding me. He shook his head slowly. "No, you don't understand yet. The depot does not just punish, it selects. It chooses those worthy of its secrets, and those who are expendable." I frowned. "Expendable? You mean the vanished employees, the ones in the journals?" He sighed. "They weren't expendable. They were unready, ignorant, and you, perhaps, are unready as well. But I can help you survive if you trust me." I did. I had no choice but to trust him. He had knowledge, experience, perhaps even some way to negotiate with the depot itself. I followed him deeper into the building, toward a side corridor I had never noticed. The walls were lined with old photographs, faces of employees spanning decades, many smiling, some terrified. Every so often, one face would be scratched out, smeared, erased. "This is the ledger of lives," he said quietly. "The depot remembers all who have passed through, and all who have failed. Their shadows linger, waiting for the next to falter." I swallowed. Something about his tone unsettled me. He spoke like a guide, but also like someone complicit in the depot's horrors. I pushed the thought aside. Survival required focus. We reached a small windowless room at the end of the corridor. Dust floated in the air, disturbed by our passage. He motioned toward a set of papers and journals, some covered in symbols I didn't understand. "Study these. Know the rules, not as words, but as actions. They are your lifeline." I bent down, skimming a journal. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A photograph of the caretaker himself, taken decades ago. And yet, the date scribbled in the corner read 1954. My pulse quickened. This was the same man, identical. Same stooped posture, same shadowed eyes, same thin coat. I looked up at him. How is this possible?" Yori smiled faintly, not answering. "Time is irrelevant here. The depot preserves. It selects. And sometimes it preserves its guides." A sudden crash from the main hall interrupted him. The depot had reacted to something outside this room, or perhaps to our very presence. The shadows outside the door writhed, pressing against the walls, coiling like smoke. I felt the old instinct of survival spike in me, stronger than curiosity, stronger than trust. When I turned back, he was gone. Not hiding, not behind a corner, but simply vanished. The journals lay on the floor as if he had never been there. My hands shook as I picked them up, scanning desperately for answers. Had he been human at all? Had he been part of the depot's will all along? Or had he been preserved, trapped, like the others, a warning in human form? Panic surged. I ran to the main hall. The depot felt alive in a way I hadn't fully understood until that moment. Every shadow pulsed, every creak and groan carried intent. The absence of the caretaker, my only supposed mentor, made the reality undeniable. I was utterly alone. I had been relying on someone who might have been complicit, or worse, a conduit for the depot itself. I stumbled across the hall, breath ragged. The shadows followed, sliding along the floor, curling around corners, probing. I understood now that the caretaker's guidance had been incomplete. He had given rules, yes, but perhaps he had also lured me into situations that tested not just my obedience, but my usefulness. A whisper curled along the walls, almost mocking. "The tracks remember, and so do I." I fell to my knees, the journals clutched to my chest. The betrayal lore revelation was staggering. The man I had trusted, the voice of guidance, had either been erased, preserved, or part of the depot all along. Every rule, every shadow, every whisper now carried double weight. Not only did the depot enforce its will, but I had no human anchor left to mediate, explain, or intervene. And then I realized the final, most terrifying truth. The caretaker's absence meant that I was next. Without guidance, without intercession, every rule I had learned could fail me. Every shadow could reach, every whisper could ensnare. The depot had removed my buffer. The game was no longer about learning. It was about surviving long enough to obey. By the time I collapsed against the wall, trembling, I understood something essential. Trust here was a liability. Even those who seemed to help were entwined with the depot's will. I could no longer count on anyone, human or otherwise. The only thing I could rely on was myself and the fragile, dangerous knowledge of the rules. The depot waited, patient and relentless. And now, I had no mentor to protect me from what came next. I didn't sleep that night. Not that sleep was possible anymore. The depot had changed, with the caretaker gone, vanished, or reclaimed. I felt it watching me more openly, as if a veil had been lifted. The walls seemed closer, the shadows darker, the air thicker. Even the ticking of the old station clock had slowed, dragging time into an unbearable stretch. I clutched the journals like a lifeline. Pages scrawled in frantic handwriting told of choices, last choices, desperate ones. Former employees who tried to flee, who tried to bargain, who tried to destroy the depot. Their fates ended in ink smudges and unfinished sentences. None had survived. Or if they had, they hadn't written about it. I paced the main hall, torn between two equally impossible paths. I could try to escape, run out through the front doors, leap over the tracks, ignore the whispers and the shadows, but the rules forbade it. And everything I had seen proved that disobedience was fatal. Or I could stay, live by the rules, and slowly become like the caretaker. Another preserved ghost, bound to the depot's will. My flashlight flickered. The rails hummed faintly underfoot, a vibration more felt than heard. The whisper followed soon after. Choose. The tracks remember. The choice wasn't simple. I had begun to sense that the depot wasn't just a building. It was a threshold, a living thing feeding off decisions, off human will. It wanted obedience, yes, but it also wanted sacrifice. Maybe that was its game, to trap someone long enough for them to become part of it. I opened one of the journals, to a page marked with a strip of torn cloth, scrawled across the yellowed paper in black ink. Breaking a rule can end you, but sometimes breaking one the right way ends the depot's hold. There is no map, only instinct. I stared at the words. The idea lodged in my mind like a splinter. Breaking a rule, intentionally, might be the only way out. But which one? And what would happen if I guessed wrong? My heart was hammered. I walked toward the platform. The depot felt aware, anticipatory, like an animal circling its prey. The rules echoed in my mind like a litany. Never step on the tracks after dusk. Never answer the whistle. Never follow shadows against the light. Never. The whistle came then, sharp, echoing through the entire depot. It felt like a demand. My skin prickled. This was it. A test. A trap. A chance. I stood at the edge of the platform, staring at the tracks. They glowed faintly under the dim, broken lamps, pulsing like veins under skin. I knew stepping onto them after dusk was a death sentence. But maybe that was what the journals meant. Breaking a rule the right way could break the depot's hold. The whisper came again. low and insistent, almost human. Step forward, be chosen, or be erased. My entire body trembled. I imagined the caretaker decades ago, standing where I stood, making some version of this same choice. Maybe he had failed. Maybe that's why he was still here, or why he had vanished. I took a step forward. My foot hovered over the track. The air thickened, pressing against me like water. Shadows gathered, coiling along the walls, reaching. The whistle rose in pitch, a scream of steel and steam. Then I stepped onto the track. For a moment, nothing happened. Silence, stillness. The depot seemed to hold its breath. I expected to be torn apart, swallowed by shadows, obliterated. Instead, I felt something shift inside me, around me. A pulling, a tearing sensation, like a cord snapping. The shadows recoiled. The hum of the rails stopped. The whistle cut off mid-scream. The depot shuddered, the entire building trembling under some unseen strain. My vision blurred, and for a heartbeat I glimpsed something vast beyond the depot, endless tracks, stretching into darkness. Each rail a thin, glowing line, disappearing into nothing. Things moved along those tracks, huge, patient, unseen, forbidden realms, just as the caretaker had hinted. And then I was back, standing on the track, the depot silent, watching. I realized I was still alive. I had broken the rule, and something had changed. The whisper came again, but softer now, almost a sigh. You have chosen. I stepped off the track, legs shaking. The depot no longer felt like it was pressing against me. The shadows retreated to the far corners. For the first time since I arrived, I felt the faintest breath of outside air. A door at the end of the hall stood open, light spilling through it like a wound in the darkness. But I also felt something else, a weight in my chest, deep and cold. The sense that something had entered me when I stepped onto the track. Not a voice, not yet. Just a presence, patient, waiting. I staggered toward the open door, the journal still clutched in my hand. My heart pounded. The depot had allowed me to break a rule without punishment, but it hadn't been free. Nothing here was free. And as I neared the door, as the outside light bathed my face for the first time in days, I knew that survival here didn't mean escape. It meant carrying a piece of the depot with me. I stepped through anyway. The sunlight outside felt impossibly bright. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe I had survived, that I had finally escaped the depot's relentless grasp. The wind smelled clean. The sky stretched endless and calm. I walked away slowly, half expecting the shadows to reach out and drag me back. But nothing came. Still, a part of me felt heavy. My chest ached with a cold weight I couldn't explain. The journals pressed against my side, their leather covers worn smooth by my grip. I glanced down at them. I had survived the depot's rules. Yes, but I could still feel it inside me. A faint, patient presence, lingering at the edges of my thoughts. I tried to reassure myself. Maybe it was over. Maybe I had broken the rules the right way, just as the old journal had suggested. My legs carried me down the road, away from the depot. Yet every shadow I passed seemed to stretch a little too far, curl a little too deliberately. Every whisper of wind reminded me of the depot's patient, observing will. Hours passed. I didn't look back. The depot remained out of sight, a silent silhouette against the horizon. I thought I was safe until I realized I could hear it again. Faint but unmistakable. The low hum of rails, the soft creak of doors opening somewhere in the distance. Not behind me, but beneath me. Threading through the very ground I walked on. The journals rattled in my bag, as if nudged by unseen fingers. I tried to shake the sensation, telling myself it was memory, imagination, but deep down, I knew better. I had stepped onto the track, and in doing so, I had made a connection. A part of the depot had followed me into the world beyond its walls, patient, watching, waiting by nightfall. I had stopped moving entirely. The hum beneath my feet grew louder, like distant trains approaching. Shadows flickered in corners of empty streets, stretching toward me, vanishing when I tried to look directly. My heartbeat echoed in my ears, a drum of dread keeping time with the unseen tracks. I understood then the truth I had tried to deny. Escape was a lie. The depot didn't just exist in that building. It existed wherever the rules, the whispers, the tracks followed. Breaking the rule had not freed MIT, had tethered me to something far larger, far older, far more patient than I could comprehend. And now, I knew it was only a matter of time before the next call, the next whistle, the next shadow would find me. I sank to the ground, clutching the journals, staring at the horizon where the depot should have been invisible, and whispered into the cold night air, I survived, didn't I? The answer came not in words, but in a single, impossibly faint echo carried through the dark. The tracks remember, and so do I.